Anyway, let's open in prayer, and then we'll begin. We're going to be talking about, is there a Book of Mormon geography? And if so, where must a Latter-day Saint go to visit the Book of Mormon Lands? So let's just, you want to go there? Okay, all right. Yeah, I'm going to start a tour group here.
There you go.
Okay, let's pray. Father, we do thank you for this time that you've given us. We pray that we use it wisely, and certainly we want to use it to your glory. And Lord, as we see some of the things that we're going to be looking at today, it's going to be very easy for us to chuckle. And granted, some things are kind of humorous, but sadly, you have so many people believing this today. And certainly our heart goes out to the LDS people, many of whom don't know anything else but their Mormonism. And I pray that perhaps by sharing this information that it can be used to perhaps be used by the Holy Spirit to open the eyes of the blind. And we do thank you for the opportunities you give us to do that. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I'm going to begin with a quote from a professor. Well, he's retired now, but Lou Midgley. And he's an interesting guy. He's a retired BYU political science professor, and he taught at BYU from 1960 to 1996. But he makes a comment that I think fits our subject quite well. I was hoping I could find one that was more from a general authority, which I do have one, but I think what Midgley says here really sets the stage for what we're going to try and to understand in this presentation. Lou Midgley, he said, there is no middle ground on the question of whether the Book of Mormon is an authentic ancient text. On this, but not, of course, on every issue, we are confronted with an either-or possibility. There is nothing in the Book of Mormon or in Joseph Smith's account of its coming forth that suggests that it should be read as anything other than historical fact. So that's a basic premise when it comes to the Book of Mormon. I've talked to many Latter-day Saints about this. They all tend to believe that this is a historical book. Joseph Smith taught it as if it was a historical book, that the people that it mentions, the Jaredites, the Lamanites, the Nephites, were actual people group, and so forth and so on. So there's really no question about this. I just wanted to have him state the fact. Now, I'm also going to show you this statement from Jeffrey R. Holland. Jeffrey R. Holland, at this moment, serves as an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he wrote a book called Christ in the New Covenant. And on page 345, he says something very similar. He says, to consider that everything of saving significance in the church stands or falls on the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, and by implication, the prophet Joseph Smith's account of how it came forth is as sobering as it is true. It is a sudden death proposition. Either the Book of Mormon is what the prophet Joseph said it is, or this church and its founder are false. A deception from the first instance onward. Now, we, looking from the outside, could probably say this sounds like a lot of bravado, because we hear people say things like this. Well, if you could show me that this isn't what it is, then you're right, it's false. Then when you show them it isn't what it is, they still believe it, which is unfortunate, but I see that happen all the time. I'm sure Jeffrey Holland, if I could show him that the story of how the Book of Mormon came forth, going back to the visitation of the angel Moroni, and then, of course, his retrieving the plates, carrying them for a distance of 3 miles, jumping over logs, fighting off attackers, running at the top of his speed, just cannot be duplicated. I don't think Jeffrey Holland's going to leave the church. It's just not going to happen. But it sure sounds like a good story the way he's telling it here, and for many people, that is convincing enough for them. That, well, if he believes it, then I'm going to believe it as well. Then we have Joseph Smith. Speaking of the angel Moroni, he said, there was a book deposited, written upon gold plates, given an account of the former inhabitants of this continent, and the source from whence they sprang. Now, I like citing this from Joseph Smith's history because this is supposedly coming from the mouth of the angel Moroni, and that becomes significant because We know from reading the Book of Mormon account, Moroni, the son of Mormon, was the last of the Nephites to handle the plates. He handled the plates. Not only did he handle them, but he also wrote on them. He was the last to add to the gold plates. So if anybody would have known what the metal content of the plates would have been, you would think it would be the angel Moroni, because he was an eyewitness to this. He was the one that buried them while he was a human, which of course raises a theological problem, because humans don't become angels. Angels are created angels. But in Mormonism, in this case, you have a human becoming an angel. But it's kind of weird in Mormon theology, because most Latter-day Saints, if you were to ask them, well, when you die and after judgment, do you want to become an angel? I've never had them say yes. They always want to become gods. If anything, they want to become a god. Well, why don't they want to become an angel? Because some in Mormon history have taught that if you're not quite as good as you could have been, you're going to be an angel. You'll be a servant, which always makes me ask the question, then why did Moroni come back as an angel? What did he do that would prevent him, we assume, from eventually reaching godhood? Do you go from angel to God? The LDS leaders don't really go into this kind of detail. But the fact is, Moroni knew what the metal of the plates would have been had they really existed. Now, in the History of the Church, Volume 4, and this is page 537 to 538, we are informed by these records that America in ancient time has been inhabited by two distinct races of people. The first were called the Jaredites, and they came directly from the Tower of Babel. The second race came directly from the city of Jerusalem about 600 years before Christ. They were principally Israelites of the descendants of Joseph. The Jaredites were destroyed about the time that the Israelites came from Jerusalem, who succeeded them in the inheritance of the country. The principal nation of the second race fell in battle towards the close of the 4th century. The remnant are the Indians that now inhabit this country. Now, of course, DNA has not been very friendly to the LDS Church. It has not been very friendly to the Book of Mormon narrative, because we know that that just is not true. Native Americans in this continent certainly are not related to the Semitic people that were over in Israel. And so that has caused them to do a lot of backpedaling, especially when it comes to the introduction of the Book of Mormon and such. But I want to point this out in this next slide, and that is a typical Bible Lands tour. Now, several of us here have been to Israel. We've seen a lot of the sites that there are over there. And just to give you an example, a very typical Bible Lands tour, unless, of course, you go with my associate, Eric Johnson, he'll take you to those plus many more. His theory is you can sleep when you get home, okay? So instead of seeing maybe 3 places in a day, you're probably going to see 6 with Eric, and it's a good tour if you ever go on one of his. But here's just a small list of some of the things that you will see, like Jerusalem, Megiddo, Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, Bet Shean, Hezekiah's Tunnel, places like this. This is pretty typical of what you would see if you were to go to Israel. Now, visiting the Book of Mormon sites is not so easy, all right? It's just not that easy. And there's a good reason for that. Let me just show you this book. This is from John Lewis Lund. And this is a fascinating statement that he makes here. But every once in a while, these guys will come out with something that you just go, wow, I'm surprised he admitted that. And he did. He said, many members of the church are confused about the disagreements over where the primary events of the Book of Mormon took place. This confusion is the result of well-meaning members of the church advocating 3 different geographical places. Adding to the confusion are contradictory statements made by some church leaders. And he's right. Even church leaders have not been consistent as to where these alleged Book of Mormon lands were located. And it's an interesting squabble that's within the church. This is one of those areas where I like to just stand by and just watch them fight about it. And I don't have to say a word, just let them go at it. There was an article in the Mormon Times newspaper. This was back in 2010. I'm not even sure if this paper still exists, but when I saw this, I just had to get a picture of it. As you can see from the title, The Fight Over Book of Mormon Geography. And it shows two men arguing, and one of them standing more on Mexico and the other standing more on what's present-day United States. And the subtitle is, Debate is Heated, but is it necessary for one's salvation to know the location? So they would argue it's not a salvific issue, so who cares? That's kind of the attitude that I have found with some Latter-day Saints when I talk to them about this. Well, here's the three geographic theories, the geographical theories that are being mentioned here. There's the hemispheric model, claims that the people of the Book of Mormon lived throughout North, Central, and South America. The whole area there. That would be the hemispheric model. Then you have the limited geography, or the Mesoamerican theory, the model, and that places the narrow neck of land, which is a specific location in the Book of Mormon, at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, with the land northward being central Mexico, the land southward being generally Guatemala, southeastern Mexico, and such. Then you have North America, or the Heartland model. This is kind of a new challenge, as I put here on the scene. This is supported by guys like Rodney Meldrum and Wayne May. They've done a number of videos on this subject, written a number of books. They have a website that's pretty sophisticated, and for many it probably looks very convincing. But they hold more to a position that the Book of Mormon lands were in the basic northern United States, the Ohio Valley, Mississippi Valley area, and places like that. And they argue that they have evidence that supports that. Now, the scholars, like at BYU, for the most part, I find they more hold to a more Central American theory, which would be the limited geography theory. And so these two groups, they don't really get along very well. I've read some of their arguments, and they can be kind of nasty to each other, and if it's not a salvific issue, what's the big argument over? I don't know, but they take it pretty seriously. So there are these basic theories, and let me just give you a problem with some of these theories. This is a partial itinerary from a local travel agency in the area where I live. I live in Sandy, Utah, and there's a travel agency there. It's called funforlesstours.com if you want to check them out. But they had a list of the itinerary of where you're going to go if you want to see the Book of Mormon lands. And so here's what they say you're going to see. First of all, you're going to go to Mexico City to see the great ruins of Teotihuacan. Yeah, okay. How does that prove the Book of Mormon? It doesn't, okay? That's the one place they know for sure what it is, and really it's not all that convincing. Then you have like the ruins of Palenque. Now I want you to listen very carefully to the language here. Considered by many as the best in Central America. Again, who cares? Okay, who cares? The ruins of Pomona, and that's not Pomona, California, by the way. Okay, then we have, and I always mess up how to pronounce this, Yaxha, or I think is, yeah, something like that. We're going to travel near the Belize border and visit these beautiful ruins. Now, so far, we haven't really seen any definitive Book of Mormon lands being mentioned here, do we? It's just, this is where you're going to go, and it's beautiful and considered the best in some areas. Okay, now we get to the ruins of Tikal, probably the most impressive ruins in Central America. Again, that's not really proving anything. And then we get travel by boat on the Mayan Nile, considered by many to be the River Sidon. Now we're getting into a location or a name that is actually in the Book of Mormon. The River Sidon is mentioned in this, but notice what it says, considered by many to be the River Sidon. Well, who do you think the many are? They're all Latter-day Saints. They're all Latter-day Saints. I don't know of anyone outside the church that would hold to a position like that. Then again, we go back to the, who cares, the ruins of Copan, fabulous set of ruins located in the country of Honduras. Okay. The ruins of Kamanahuyu, prime candidate for the first city of Nephi. Prime candidate. Not a definitive place, but a prime candidate. In whose estimation? The Latter-day Saints and whoever's putting on this tour. Guatemala City, the once vast city of Nephi, is perhaps the city that is buried beneath this capital. No proof there. And then you have Lake Atitlan, prime candidate for the waters of Mormon. Now, I've often said to people, if you're ever going to take a trip to Israel, and they had a list somewhat like this that says, thought to be Jerusalem, don't book with those people, okay? Because we know where that is. There's no doubt about that. Now, if they said that about some other smaller, insignificant places over in the Holy Land, all right, that might be needed to take seriously. But you can see they have no evidence for this. And if you want to prove that I'm telling you the truth on this, I often challenge people visiting Salt Lake City to go down to the museum across from Temple Square and go in there and ask them, this is the history museum that the church owns, ask them to show you where they keep their Nephite artifacts. Now, I've done this, and it's kind of fun. But ask them to show you where they keep the Nephite artifacts. They don't have any. They don't have any. They don't even show you the actual seer stone in that museum, though they will show you a photograph of it, but not the actual seer stone, which kind of puzzles me because it's just a rock, okay? You'd think they would put that on display, but they don't. But there are no Nephite artifacts on display at their history museum. But yet, if you've ever been to Israel and you've gone to the Israel Museum, there's all sorts of stuff there. Yes?
So what did happen when you asked them where was the artifact?
Well, I'll tell you one interesting story, okay? Since you asked, thank you for asking. I was there with Eric, and at this time we were not living in Utah. We were still living in San Diego County. And we were up for a conference. And so we explained, I walked inside, and there was a very nice lady standing there. And I guess I don't know what they call themselves. I guess they would be a docent. They're not really missionaries, but they are volunteers. So I guess a docent would be a fair way to describe them. And so she greeted us very nicely, as they are very nice people. And so I explained, we're from out of town. We've come to your museum. We want to see your Nephite artifacts. Could you show us where you keep them? And she looked kind of puzzled. She had a look on her face like, we should have these. Why don't we? So standing off to the side of us, there was a man talking to some people there. And she went over, she kind of excused herself, went over, tapped him on the shoulder, told him, I guess, what we had asked. He turned and saw us, acknowledged us, excused himself from who he was talking to, and then came over to us, and I repeated my question. Where do you keep your Nephite artifacts? And it was an interesting body language. He kind of tilted his head, and he says, there are no Nephite artifacts. He says, the church doesn't even know where to look. Now, I did not know it at the time, but I found out later on. We were talking to the museum curator. So if there's anybody that you would think would know, it probably would have been this guy. And he admitted they have no Nephite artifacts. But his statement, they don't know where to look or dig, is an important statement because they don't. They don't. And that's going to become very important. Now, remember, I was telling you about a man by the name of Rod Meldrum, okay? Rod Meldrum has his own tours, okay? He'll take you to the Book of Mormon tours. Now, this is where it becomes very important. If you're going to ever take a tour to go see the Book of Mormon Lands, you have to ask what position they hold. Do they hold to a heartland model, United States area position like Rod Meldrum, or do they hold more to a limited geography theory like the BYU scholars and such? I don't find too many Latter-day Saints that still hold to the hemispheric model. I just don't see that when I'm talking to Latter-day Saints. But if you took Rod Meldrum's North America Book of Mormon tour, you would go to the Hill Cumorah, which is, of course, near Palmyra, New York, near where Joseph Smith lived, and this is the sacred Book of Mormon site. Now, Rod Meldrum talks with much more confidence, okay? This is the sacred Book of Mormon site. Well, that's because that's what the church says about this hill. Then you go to Niagara Falls, what the Mohawk Indians call the narrow neck of land, okay? All right? I don't know where he gets how that becomes a narrow neck of land, depending on where it's because of where it's located, but all right. Then you go to the Johnson Humrick House Museum that houses the famous holy stones that were found in a Hopewell mound near Newark, Ohio. He's really into the Hopewell mounds. Now, there's been rebuttals written in response to Meldrum's position on this from Latter-day Saints, saying that there's just no way that the Hopewell mounds can really be speaking of the people mentioned in the Book of Mormon. For one, they were not a warlike people, and there weren't very many of them, as you would have in the Book of Mormon story that talks about these people being in the tens of thousands. So it just doesn't seem to fit. You've got the Hopewell earthwork sites. We've talked about that in Chillicothe, Ohio. Then you have Fort Ancient, another hilltop fortress with miles of embankments and trenches. And again, does this really prove that this is related to the Book of Mormon? No, the evidence doesn't really do that. But Rod Meldrum and the people that agree with him tend to make these connections, and that so they come up with this. And when you talk to Rod Meldrum, he sounds like he can be very convincing if you want to believe this. But if you're kind of skeptical, I don't know if it would be all that convincing for you. Then you have day 7, you're going to see Zelph's Mound near Griggsville, Illinois. This has actually a mention in LDS history. This is the sacred site where Joseph Smith had a vision of a righteous Lamanite warrior who died in the final struggles between the Nephites and the Lamanites. Now, if you read the story, the background story on this, Zelph was a white Lamanite. Now, how do we know that? Because Joseph Smith got a revelation. They found a skeleton, and Smith gets a revelation that this guy's name was Zelph, and he started to give a whole history about this guy just based on these bones. But Joseph Smith would do that a lot of times. He would just instantly get revelations, and if you believe Joseph Smith's a prophet, you're naturally not going to question what he's saying. You're going to believe that he's telling you something that's really coming from God. Then you have Montrose, Iowa, near Zarahemla, and Big Springs, Missouri, the proposed Waters of Mormon based on location, distance, and description. And then day 12, you have the Valley of Adam-on-Diamond, which is near Gallatin, Missouri. It was on this sacred site, this land, that the prophet Joseph found the remnants of an old Nephite altar near a place there called Tower Hill. And has anybody ever been to Adam-on-Diamond? Because Keith's been there. It's an interesting place. The church owns this area, and it is near Gallatin, Missouri. And this, where it talks about this ancient Nephite altar, have you ever seen the book Joseph Smith Begins His Work, Volume 1? Joseph Smith Begins His Work, Volume 1. It was put together by a guy by the name of Wilford Wood. And it's Volume 1 is actually an 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon that they have reproduced, but he inserts in it pictures that he has taken of various sites in Mormon history. And one of the pictures that he has in this book is a pile of rocks under a tree that he says are the remnants of this sacred Nephite altar. Now, that pile of rocks is not there any longer. I would guess maybe Mormon tourists kept taking rocks with them, and they never replenished them, I guess. But there's no such pile there anymore. But if you're a faithful Latter-day Saint, and if that's what you thought it was, boy, I've got a piece of a Nephite altar there. So really, again, it's all speculation. There's really no evidence for this at all. Now, the Hill Cumorah, which is a huge issue in this whole story, because that's where Moroni buried the plates, and that's where Joseph Smith was eventually told to find the plates. We have Orson Pratt here, who was a Mormon apostle. He said about 375 years after the birth of Christ, the Nephites occupying North America, so notice he's taken a more heartland model position on this. The Lamanites, South America, which would then, if you're going to add that, now it sounds like it's more hemispheric. Okay, so they're kind of going from north down to south. And as I mentioned, I don't hear too many that talk like that anymore. And that the wars existed between them for nearly 50 years. The Lamanites began to overpower the Nephites, and they drove them northward from the narrow neck of land. Now, northward from the narrow neck of land. Now, is that the narrow neck of land? That's Niagara Falls? No, so now we're in Canada? Okay, I'm just going by what I'm reading here. But he says the narrow neck of land, which we call the Isthmus of Darien, or Panama. That's going back south again. So you see, we're not getting a consistent explanation here of this geography. Burning, destroying, and desolating every city, town, and village through which they passed, the Nephites continued to flee before their conquerors until they came into the interior of the state of New York. See, now we're getting more to where Joseph Smith lives now. The great and last battle in which several 100,000, actually the Book of Mormon claims that there were 230,000 Nephites that were killed at the Hill Cumorah. That doesn't include how many Lamanites were killed in this battle, if it really took place at all, which I don't think it did. But anyway, several 100,000 Nephites perished was on the Hill Cumorah, the same hill from which the plates were taken by Joseph Smith. So let's talk about this for a minute here, because when you read the Book of Mormon, it doesn't give you a specific census of how many Nephites and Lamanites lived at any one time, but it does give us little clues as to how many possibly existed. I just gave you one clue: 230,000 Nephites killed at the Hill Cumorah. And of course, if there were Lamanites involved in that battle, usually you figure maybe the same amount of casualties on the other side. I don't know. But anyway, there's other battles that take place too that also involve the deaths of thousands of these people. Some estimate that you could have anywhere from hundreds of thousands of Nephites and Lamanites up to maybe 1 million of them. Let me just tell you something. If you were to talk to most archaeologists and you were to ask them, can we lose a civilization of about 1 million people? Is it possible to just have no evidence whatsoever of that large of a population? It's not likely, because they will tend to leave their junk behind, and of course we call that junk archaeology, right? And so, but that's what we're supposed to believe, that they just disappeared and took everything with them, and there's just no evidence of their existence whatsoever.
Except for the rocks.
The rocks? Oh, the Nephite altar.
Yeah. There's a rock there.
Okay, James. I'll humor you. I know. You're just messing with my head. That's okay. Let's get back to the Zelph the White Lamanite story. I always found this fascinating. First discovered by members of Zion's camp. Now, we know Zion's camp was a contingency of like a Mormon militia type. They were going to go west, and they were going to help Mormon settlers that were being persecuted. And it was a failure. It was an expedition of about 150 men that left Kirtland, Ohio in early May 1834 to assist the persecuted saints in Missouri. In early June, they came upon several mounds which had been thrown up by the ancient inhabitants of this country, Nephites and Lamanites, that's what they assume. The brethren procured a shovel and a hoe, and removing the earth to a depth of about 1 foot, discovered the skeleton of a man almost entire, and between his ribs the stone point of a Lamanitish arrow, which evidently produced his death. Now, Joseph Smith gives an explanation of this. Remember, I was telling you, he would just come up with these revelations and do all this explaining. And this is what we read in the History of the Church, Volume 2, page 79. The visions of the past being opened to my understanding by the Spirit of the Almighty, I discovered that the person whose skeleton was before us was a white Lamanite, a large, now why is that peculiar? Because Lamanites were supposed to be dark-skinned. Those that followed Laman and his rebellion, God cursed them with a dark skin because it was seen as your skin color was a sign of your spirituality. And of course, white skin was good, dark skin was bad. A white Lamanite, a large, thick-set man, and a man of God. His name was Zelph. He was a warrior and chieftain under the great prophet Onondagas, who was known from the hill Cumorah, or eastern sea, to the Rocky Mountains. Eastern sea to the Rocky Mountains. The curse was taken from Zelph, or at least in part. One of his thigh bones was broken by a stone flung from a sling. While in battle, years before his death, he was killed in battle by the arrow found among his ribs during the last great struggle of the Lamanites and Nephites. Now, look at all the details that Joseph Smith adds to this. He just starts coming up with all sorts of things to add to this story, and probably sounded quite convincing to a lot of his followers. Now, William J. Hamlin, who's a Mormon apologist, worked for the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. I'm not really sure what Bill Hamlin is doing now, but he had a response to this story, and it was published in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. And he said this about it. He said, the Zelph story is another piece of evidence that is frequently used to associate Joseph Smith with the hemispheric geography model. It is claimed that Joseph Smith had a revelation concerning the discovery of some bones in Illinois during the Zion's Camp March in 1834. However, the version of the story that appeared in the documentary History of the Church, although editorially couched in the first person, does not in fact represent Joseph Smith's own written account of the event, nor a revelation, nor was it editorially approved by Joseph Smith. Rather, it is an editorial compilation by Willard Richards, written in manuscript between 1842 and 1843. It was not published until 1846, after Joseph Smith's death, and so could not have had his final editorial approval. In the printed version, editorial deletions and changes in the original manuscript, which might have represented Joseph Smith's work, were mistakenly ignored. Now, I find this fascinating, because when you look at the history of the documentary History of the Church, much of it was written in first person, as if Joseph Smith's writing it. And we know now that that's not really what happened. And so he's kind of throwing this whole thing out because he's making up these what do we say? Forgetting what word it should be, but he's making his own criteria of what he thinks it ought to be. The problem is are we really to believe that who's putting this down is not faithful, or at least they think it's faithful to the story that Joseph Smith taught or said at that particular time? The reason I ask the question that way is because several respected Mormons verify the Zelph story. You have 6 men wrote diary accounts concerning Zelph. Wilford Woodruff, who would become the 4th president of the church. Heber C. Kimball, who would be a member of the First Presidency. George A. Smith, also a member of the First Presidency. You have Levi Hancock, Moses Martin, and Reuben McBride. They all talked about this. And then you have 10th President Joseph Fielding Smith, who said, this revelation to the prophet in relation to Zelph is something that our modern critics should consider carefully, who claim that the Nephites and Lamanites did not contend in their final struggle in these northern parts of the United States, and that their activities were confined to Central America and perhaps as far north as part of Mexico. Notice what Joseph Fielding Smith is doing here. He's siding with the story of Zelph, and he's really going after those who think that the Book of Mormon lands are down in Central America, because Joseph Fielding Smith did not hold to that position. And so he's criticizing that view. Now, let's go on here. We have Wilford Woodruff and Heber C. Kimball. Joseph Smith, Brother Joseph, had a vision respecting the person. He said he was a white Lamanite. His name was Zelph. Now, this is in Wilford Woodruff's journal. Why would Wilford Woodruff lie about this? why would he purposely put in wrong information? It seems to go along with what we have in this other record that we read earlier. Heber C. Kimball said, while on our way, we felt anxious to know who the person was who had been killed by that arrow. It was made known to Joseph that he had been an officer who fell in battle in the last destruction among the Lamanites, and his name was Zelph. This caused us to rejoice much, to thank God was so mindful of us to show these things to his servant. Brother Joseph had inquired of the Lord, and it was made known in a vision. Now, here's what's kind of irritating sometimes, though. These apologists seem to forget all of what these other people, eyewitnesses, said, and they just throw it out because it doesn't fit their narrative. And that's not totally uncommon sometimes when we're looking at some of these statements regarding LDS history. What about the Garden of Eden? Well, that is going to take us back towards Adam-on-Diamond. James Talmage said, though there is no uniform belief among Christian scholars as to the geographical location of Eden, the majority claim that it was in Persia. The Latter-day Saints have more exact knowledge on the matter, a revelation having been given through Joseph Smith at Spring Hill, Missouri, May 19, 1838, in which that place is named by the Lord Adam-on-Diamond. Because, said he, it is the place where Adam shall come to visit his people, or the Ancient of Days shall sit, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet. The Ancient of Days. Now, there's an interesting thing that we need to look at when it comes to that name. The Ancient of Days. Joseph Smith taught that the Ancient of Days was Adam. He's Adam. And it always makes me uncomfortable when we're singing. There's this one song that we sing every once in a while that talks about the Ancient of Days. And I always wonder if there's a Latter-day Saint in this congregation, he's going to think we're singing to Adam. Okay, which we're not, of course, because the Ancient of Days is another name for God in the book of Daniel. But Adam-on-Diamond, as I said, is a property that is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints right now. You can go there, and it's like a self-guided tour. You drive around the road and stuff. But there's some interesting signs when you go there. For instance, there's this one sign, as you can see here, right, the Valley of Adam-on-Diamond. 3 years previous to the death of Adam, he called Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalaleel, Jared, and Enoch, and Methuselah, who were all high priests, with the residue of his posterity who were righteous, in the Valley of Adam-on-Diamond, and they were bestowed upon them, and there are bestowed upon them his last blessing. I bet you didn't know that, did you? But yes, they were all over in this American continent somehow. Then you go to the Nephite altar that's near Tower Hill, and this is what it says on this sign. This morning we, Saturday, I'm quoting the history of the church here below. This is a sign that you'll see that's out in that area, but this gives you an explanation of what it's talking about from the History of the Church, Volume 3. May 19th, 1838, this morning we struck our tents and formed the line of march, crossing Grand River at the mouth of Honey Creek and Nelson's Ferry. We pursued our course up the river, mostly through timber, for about 18 miles when we arrived at Colonel Lyman White's home. He lives at the foot of Tower Hill, a name I gave the place in consequence of the remains of an old Nephite altar or tower that stood there where we camped for the Sabbath. Now you can see some of the conflict here because this is putting the Book of Mormon Lands in a North American setting here. And of course you have a lot of the scholars from BYU saying, no, it couldn't be up there. It had to be down here in a very small area. Now remember that Nephite altar that I was talking about? There's the picture that Wilford Wood had in his book. The caption says, Adam-on-Diamond, showing stones from Adam's altar at Gallatin, Missouri. So there's the picture.
That's Adam with the picture?
Yeah, and it's in the book, Joseph Smith Begins His Work, Volume 1. And it says in 1838, after the main body of the church had moved to Missouri, the saints built several towns and projected others in Caldwell. This would be Caldwell County, which was a county designated just for the Latter-day Saints. It was supposed to relieve a lot of the tension between the Mormons that were moving into that part of Missouri and the clashes that they were going to be having with the locals. A lot of the locals didn't like the Mormons coming in, although at first we understand they welcomed them with open arms, but it did not take very long before they kind of outlived their welcome. And so there was a lot of tension that was going on. So Caldwell County was designated just for the Latter-day Saints. Now, they didn't stay in Caldwell County, and this is what caused later problems as well. There was a lot of tension during that time, and the Latter-day Saints did receive a lot of persecution during that particular time. But then it goes on to say one of those towns was at Spring Hill, Davis County, where the men who made the survey for a new settlement came upon the ruins of an ancient altar situated on a wooded hill overlooking the surrounding country. Straightway they reported to the prophet their interesting find. He, upon beholding it, said to those who were with him, "There is the place where Adam offered up sacrifice after he was cast out of the garden." Came all the way over here from where he was. And I mean, again, and he can say just about anything he wants and people will believe it. Now you have Joseph Fielding Smith, the 10th president of the church. He said, Joseph Smith locates Cumorah in western New York. Perhaps this matter could rest at this point, but the question of the territory now embraced within the United States, having been in possession of the Nephites and Lamanites before the death of Mormon, carries some weight in the determining of this matter. In the light of Revelation, it is absurd for anyone to maintain that the Nephites and Lamanites did not possess this northern land. So see, he did not hold to that limited geography theory at all. He was very critical of it. You have Ezra Taft Benson, teachings of Ezra Taft Benson. Consider how very fortunate we are to be living in this land of America. This was the place of three former civilizations, that of Adam, that of the Jaredites, and that of the Nephites. This was also the place where our Heavenly Father and His Son, Jesus Christ, appeared to Joseph Smith, inaugurating this last dispensation. Now, we have Dr. Michael Coe, and Michael Coe really has no dog in this fight, okay? Now, he's since passed away. As you can see, he died in 2019. Dr. Coe wrote a number of books on anthropology and archaeology of Central America. He was like the go-to guy when it came to the Mayans and so forth and so on. Well, in 1973, he wrote a paper that was published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. The Dialogue is more for an intellectual audience. It's not like the Liahona, which is really kind of just anecdotal and stories and things like this. This is more in-depth historical and even theological subjects that's covered in Dialogue. Well, in 1973, he said, the bare facts of the matter are that nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever shown up in any New World excavation which would suggest to a dispassionate observer that the Book of Mormon, as claimed by Joseph Smith, is a historical document relating to the history of early migrants to our hemisphere. Now, this is a guy who spent his life studying this subject. And what makes Coe an interesting person to study, because I've read this article, I've gone through it, and we did radio shows on this article that he did, is though he was not a member, he did do a lot of studying on this, and he was very familiar with the subject matter. He was not talking really, in my opinion, not even as an amateur, because he has studied what the Mormon position is on it. And I think that's probably why the editors of Dialogue felt that they could use what he had to say in this publication, which probably upset a lot of members when they read it, okay? Because he's not giving the party line here. Well, that was 1973. Now, I was using Dr. Coe's statement when talking with Latter-day Saints for a number of years. And 2 decades passed, and I remember hearing from some Latter-day Saints, they were giving me the old, well, Bill, that was 20 years ago, you know. They found lots of stuff since then. So I wrote Dr. Coe myself. He was alive at the time, obviously, and I think he was still working at the Peabody Museum in Massachusetts. I'm not exactly sure. I think he was, though, because I think that's where I wrote him, was to the museum. And he wrote me back. It was on a little card. I still have it, handwritten. And he said, "Dear Mr. McKeever," because I asked him, "Have you changed your mind? Have you seen anything that would allow you to change your mind since 1973? He said, "Dear Mr. McKeever," at that point I look around and go, "Where's my dad? What's he talking about? I haven't changed my views about the Book of Mormon since my 1973 article. I have seen no archaeological evidence before or since that date which would convince me that there is anything that it is anything but a fanciful creation by an unusually gifted individual living in upstate New York in the early 19th century." I love how scholars have to be so nice when they, say the other guy's out to lunch. I mean, we normally are not quite like that, but anyway. But still, this is 20 years later. Now you can say 1993. Well, that seems so long ago. It does to me too. But anyway, do you remember in 2007, there was a 2-evening special that aired on PBS. One of the few times I ever watch PBS, okay? But I did want to see this. It was done by a woman named Helen Whitney. Helen Whitney put this thing together. Now, I thought Helen Whitney was brilliant in how she put this documentary together, because she interviews a lot of people, but she doesn't tell you what side they're on. In other words, when she interviews Dr. Daniel Peterson, for instance, merely said he was a professor of, I think, Arabic studies is what his title was, which is true at BYU, but she didn't say that. So if you didn't know anything about him, you go, okay, who's this guy? Well, I know who these people are because I deal with this subject all the time, so very few of them escape my notice. I know who they are and such, but I thought it was brilliant what she did. Well, she interviews Dr. Coe, but it doesn't get in the final cut. You had to go online to watch the video of her interview with him. And this is where Dr. Coe really gets into it here. And he said, "In the case of the Book of Mormon, you've got a much bigger problem. You really do. We have another part of the world where the archaeology is really very well known now. We know a lot about people like the Maya and their predecessors. So to try to find unlikely evidence in an unlikely spot, you've got a problem. And of course, listen to this, none of the finds that biblical archaeologists are rightly proud about, no finds on that level have ever come up for Mormon archaeologists, which makes it a big problem." And I'll tell you, even though that's 2007, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed, because I'll guarantee you, if they find something, it's going to end up in that museum. And there's still nothing there to this day. Now, I want to show you something. Now, we're going to go back. We're going to go back a while. 1890. This is the Juvenile Instructor. This was a publication that was put out by the church. And this is George Q. Cannon, who is making this comment. He was a member of the First Presidency. He said, "Brethren who lecture on the lands of the Nephites or the geography of the Book of Mormon are not united in their conclusions. No two of them, so far as we have learned, are agreed on all points. And in many cases, the variations amount to tens of thousands of miles. These differences of views lead to discussion, contention, and perplexity. And we believe more confusion is caused by these divergencies than good is done by the truths elicited." That's 1890. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. But let me go on in that quote. The same quote goes on to say, "For these reasons, we have strong objections to the introduction of maps and their circulation among our people, which profess to give the location of the Nephite cities and settlements. He argued that they have a tendency to mislead rather than enlighten, and they will lead to division of sentiment and be very unprofitable. We see no necessity for maps of this character, because at least much would be left to the imagination of those who prepare them." That statement right there is saying a mouthful, because that's just not how you do maps, okay? It's just not how you do them, all right? We hope that there will be no attempt made to introduce them or give them general circulation. So don't talk about this. This is not a subject we're going to put our stamp of approval on. Now, if you were to look at page 901 of the Book of Mormon Seminary Teacher's Manual, you'll find this map. Now, there's other manuals that have a map that's very similar to this. But if you look closely at it, you'll see that it has a lot of places that are mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Ammonihah, Angola, should be in Africa maybe, I don't know. The land of desolation, the land of Moron. Yeah, there really is a land of Moron. There's Melech, Zarahemla, and Zizram, and they have all these names that you can find in the Book of Mormon. Now, what they do is just take the names and you just splatter them all over there, and this is where they go. Now, there's something that you've got to take close attention to. See this little oval here? This is what it says inside there. No effort should be made to identify points on this map with any existing geographical location.
Which way is north? Yeah, which way?
I think this is probably the well, it does say that's the narrow neck of land, so there it is. And the land northward and the land southward. Now, Rob Bowman said that was a problem, okay? And it is a problem. Yes?
When you actually look at that page and it's full size, how tiny is that font that's at the bottom?
It's really small.
It is hard
It is really small. Yeah, in fact, we have this made into a sign at our center, and we have that portion blown up like that. So you can see what it says, because even standing in front of it as close as you can get, it's still hard to read. And remember, it's blown up too. It's a manual, like 8.5 by 11. All right.
Yeah.
I know, Keith. It's mind-boggling. But you see, this is what they do to these people. It's sad what the church does to their membership. It's just tragic.
I'm just wondering that those land masses, where the heck are they? What's that? It looks just like two round circles.
Yeah, it doesn't represent anything that's real. Yeah. Yeah, well, even if you looked at the narrow neck of land being down near the, near Tehuantepec, maybe Smith just didn't realize that landmass curves, okay? Perfectly legal, okay? But I don't think he realized that. So when you see land, C east, C west, here it is, C west, C east, well, that's only if you turn the map sideways. And now there was one Mormon apologist who had an answer for that. He called it a Nephite north. So it makes you wonder how people could sail across the ocean with that bad sense of direction, okay, to think that that's a Nephite north, and that, I don't know. I can't explain this myself. So what is the church position today, though? Well, you're going to find that it's not any different than it was in 1890. This is on the website of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints right now. You can find this on there. And this is what it says. Book of Mormon Geography. The church does not take a position on the specific geographic locations of Book of Mormon events in the ancient Americas. Speculation on the geography of the Book of Mormon may mislead instead of enlighten. Such a study can be a distraction from its divine purpose. Individuals may have their own opinions regarding Book of Mormon geography and other such matters about which the Lord has not spoken. However, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles urge leaders and members not to advocate those personal theories in any setting or manner that would imply either prophetic or church support for those theories. All parties should strive to avoid contention on these matters. Now, let's go back. The church does not take a position on the specific geographic locations of Book of Mormon events in ancient Americas. Remember, since you asked, when we talked to the curator of the museum, and he said they don't know where to dig or they don't know where to look. If you have no geography, you can't have archaeology. It's impossible. And they don't have a geography. So this is why they don't have any archaeology. They will not have these. Believe me, if they ever thought they found something that verified it, it would be in that museum. But they don't. Yes, Steve.
So when it says about which the Lord has not spoken, you showed slides where Joseph Fielding Smith, a prophet, had spoken.
Yes.
Definitive.
Well, and not only that, you saw a map in a church manual.
Yeah.
So while they say don't do this, they do it. Yeah, it's okay for them, which only adds to the confusion and really just gives me more things to write about. So
You know the age of the child who drew the map.
no, I don't. I don't. But I think in this area alone, we can see the superiority of the Bible. One of the things that we try to do at the Utah Christian Research Center is the front part of our building deals with the Bible as a historical message, talking about real people and such. That's okay. That's my last slide. And we're trying to show that though we don't find everything that's mentioned in the Bible, we don't expect to find everything in the Bible. But I was talking to Rob earlier that I like to use the baseball analogy. The Mormon Church is batting 0 on this subject. People who bat 0 should not be trusted to give you batting lessons, okay? And yet that's what we have here. We have found a number of things that verify stories in the Bible. And a lot of them are on display in museums. I've personally seen a lot of these myself. The Israel Museum is just a fantastic place to go see some of these places or things. And yet the LDS Church has nothing. But yet they tell their people that it's a book of real people, real places, and real events. Now we can say that about the Bible, and we have evidence to back that up. Unfortunately, the LDS people don't. They have to take this entirely by faith. And it's really not even a reasonable faith in this case. It's just not. And that's what's so sad to me in dealing with these people, because they are so sincerely believing what their church tells them and what Joseph Smith has said about some of these things.
Do you find Mormon University students challenged by any of this at all?
I can't say that I've talked to any or have read any. I don't know. I couldn't answer that question, not from personal experience.
Is it lack of exposure? They just don't have the background.
Well, that could be. Well, you know what? There have been some things that have been put out there that do kind of put a big question mark on this. But how seriously are they taken, by their peers? I don't know. I don't. So it's just, yeah, you would think that someone would say, well, wait a minute, why does God need a starship? That's always kept Kirk's main question that always I thought was the best line in the whole movie, because the rest of the movie is pretty bad. So, but I don't know. Anyone else? Yes, Steve.
They used to talk about how the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith might have plagiarized, like View of the Hebrews, I think, Smith or some other books. But how much do you think was like plagiarizing or borrowing ideas, and how much was it that Joseph Smith just really was very creative and inventive in creating these stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, a lot of Latter-day Saints like to use that in his favor. Like, how could he just come up with all these ideas? But if he was familiar with some of those works that were around during that time, he could have easily taken the theme, embellished it, and put in his own details. We do know, and the church does not deny this, that while he was translating, there was a curtain or a blanket that separated him from his scribe. Not always, but sometimes. He could have had something behind there that he was reading. We don't know. But there's all sorts of questions when it comes to the translation of that. So,
Sidney Rigdon certainly might have had a hand in that too.
As far as some of the content, yeah, you do see some of Sidney Rigdon's theology, except kind of hold a position. Rigdon comes around later. So it's already done. It's already a done deal. But certainly I think Joseph Smith was influenced by the Campbellites, and especially with their idea of a primitive church. And the church had gotten away from its original roots and things like that, and it needed to go back to what it was. And that certainly was a theme that Joseph Smith was pushing. So, but yes.
It's a little bit off your topic, but could you address the connection between Joseph Smith and the Masonic Lodge?
Joseph Smith became a Mason in 1842, was immediately elevated to, I think, the 32nd degree. He incorporates a lot of the Masonic ritual into his temple endowment ceremony in Nauvoo, because they didn't have a ceremony like that in Kirtland. Kirtland was more of a meeting house, but the endowment ceremony becomes very popular in Nauvoo. And some tend to believe, and I can see the point in this, that that's probably why some in the mob were Masons that weren't too happy with Joseph Smith. So when he tries to give the Masonic signal of distress, "Oh Lord my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" he only gets out the first 4 words before he's shot and falls out of the window. They weren't about to come to his aid, if that's why they were there. And that could have been. I don't know. I'm only speculating. But Masonry was very popular, which is kind of odd in my opinion, because there was also, right before all this time, there was a very strong anti-Masonic movement over the death of, was it William Morgan? Was that his name? Yeah, I think it was Morgan that was killed, I think in Canada somewhere. And there was a very strong anti-Masonic movement going on at that time, which that alone makes me wonder, well, why would Joseph Smith get involved in that kind of a controversy? Stay away from that, you know, but he does. It's like with the Book of Abraham. Jean-Francois Champollion cracks the code of the Rosetta Stone in 1822, okay? All the experts, what few there are over in Europe. Joseph Smith doesn't hear about this, doesn't hear about the Egyptian hieroglyphics till Michael Chandler comes to see him in 1835. My question is between 1822 and 1835, even without the internet and phones, don't you think maybe he may have heard that something's happened here with the Rosetta Stone? If he did, and he still moves forward with his translation, doesn't that sound kind of risky? Doesn't that sound kind of arrogant? Maybe he didn't know. I don't know. I don't have evidence one way or the other on this. I just find it odd that 1822, Champollion figures it out. Now, his findings are not published till years later. But still, you would think that maybe Smith might have known that he's not going to get away with this like he did with Reformed Egyptian, which nobody's ever heard of, because this is real Egyptian. This is a real language that he's going to have to deal with. So just my personal thoughts on that. So I think I'm done. Yes.
You have that final slide, but you're going to say anything about that slide you have up there?
No, I think that's the one he talked about.
I think I just did.
Yeah.
Didn't I?
All right.
Okay, thank you. You're trying to gaslighting me there. Oh,
He went off screen and
yeah, something happened with this. I don't know. There's the last one. And if you want to check out our website, there's our URL. We do put out a newsletter every other month, and if you'd like to get that, just write us, and we'll send it to you in a PDF format. If you want it in hard copy, just let us know that, and we'll be glad to send it to you for free. So, all right, thank you very much. All right.